everyone. Welcome back to Remote Work Bay. I am so excited to have Katherine Fan from thepointsguy on this first episode of my podcast. Thank you for being on my episode, Kat. Can you tell us a little bit about thepointsguy and a little bit about yourself?
Hi everyone, this is Katherine Fan. I'm a senior travel features reporter at thepointsguy. I am Taiwanese American, as you can see from this background, and I grew up in Texas and Taiwan, ending back up in Texas for college and kind of sticking around in Austin, Texas ever since.
I mean, what do you think about the situation and where do you think this is going to go? I mean, do you think that the world is going to ban Americans from traveling into their countries until we really flatten that curve?
So on the flip side, there are some countries that are only allowing American travelers to visit.
Interesting.
I would say we are a good source of tourism dollars.
Got it.
I imagine that there might be some additional restrictions or safety protocols implemented in the days to come because it's been such this second spike. We're currently talking here in early July of 2020. There's been a really steep spike of a second wave of infections here in the States in the last couple of weeks alone. And that's because a number of states have reopened. People are being a lot less careful about social distancing. And here in Texas alone, some bars opened and went well beyond the capacity that they were allowed to bring in. So all of that contributed very heavily to either reinfection or existing infection that was about to happen regardless. So yes, travelers can go internationally from the US this year, but I personally would recommend that people really hold off except for absolutely essential travel, which means that we'll probably see a lot more people visiting things like national park and just domestic destinations. Now is the perfect time for us to visit each other and to see other friends that we haven't met in other parts of the country we've always talked about. I think this is the year my girlfriends and I would love to do the road trip that we always say we want to do, but elsewhere always seems more fun.
Yep.
And that's all just because flying carries its risks inherently. So even if you are traveling as safely as possible, the less we bring it overseas, the less we come in contact with travelers from elsewhere, the better. And I would say that's probably even true for certain hotspot destinations like Florida or Texas. If you look at the headlines, for instance, New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut recently implemented a quarantine for anyone who comes from a high-risk state. And that metric is anyone whose state has had a 10% or higher spike in cases within the last 7 rolling days. Started with 9 states, and now they're at 16 as of earlier this week, and I could see that number going higher.
Right. You know, it's interesting because I also see states closing borders to, like you said, other high-risk states, right? And I was supposed to go to Chicago for a friend's birthday beginning of August. So that's literally in a couple of weeks. I actually think I have to cancel it because
Chicago has a citywide quarantine on anyone who comes in from a high-risk area as well.
Which is California. Yeah. So, I mean, it's like, what's the point of going to Chicago if I have to be quarantined for 14 days, right? Yeah. Like, unless I plan to be out there for a month, then that's a different story. But, I mean, how are airports monitoring this? Like, what if I'm from California, but I fly in to Chicago through a different state? Or do you see people doing that? Like, do you know how these airlines are monitoring, you know, people going in to these states that are banning high-risk travelers from states that are high risk?
Sure. The real answer is that we're not doing a great job of tracking any of that information. So everything reported within the US, as far as I understand, is self-reported. So a lot of people who are very conscientious are being really honest about how they're traveling. But we've heard countless stories of travelers coming in from overseas, for instance, and not even being questioned about where they've been recently. So I would not trust anyone that you pass in an airport. I would not trust that they have their reasons for why they went where they did. And it's not necessarily for us to shame anyone for that. But that doesn't mean that you can't still get sick from someone, especially with COVID-19 being a disease that sometimes passes by in an asymptomatic way. So take all the proper precautions and recognize that it isn't just your own health you're talking about. You're talking about everyone who comes in contact with you. And while you and I may be in great health, thankfully, other people may be immunocompromised, even if they're just our age, or anyone who's older or younger is at a lot higher risk for this very concerning and treatmentless disease. So yeah, I think this will impact people a lot because you're really starting to see which kinds of people travel during this time, A lot of them are doing it out of obligations. Some companies are forcing employees to start traveling again, and others are essential workers. I have a friend who works in healthcare, and there's been a dire shortage of nurses in New York City for some time. So for a while, she was looking at possibly taking a gig up there as a contract nurse, and they didn't even necessarily have the funds to pay properly for that sort of thing. So the more we give up a little bit of our creature comforts and our little luxuries, the more we're helping essential workers not have to overtax their resources. And the benefit to that is the sooner we all get to travel again.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm right there with you. You know, I'm an optimist. So I keep thinking this is going to be over in a couple weeks, couple months. And now I've come to realization that we're in this for the long haul, especially if we're living in America. Like, I question how this line is going to be flattened, considering we're just so inconsistent in terms of even state by state, how inconsistent, actually not by state, county by county.
County by county, yes, for sure.
Like LA and OC are right next to each other, and even those counties are so completely different in how they handle the situation, right?
Yes, definitely seeing that in Texas as well.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I think the best we can do at this point is to stay safe. And I have some buddies that are working at different nonprofits that work very closely with the CDC. And from what I'm hearing is that probably the earliest we're going to see some type of vaccine is end of the year, from what I'm hearing in a couple of days. And I mean,
that's pretty optimistic too.
And that's very optimistic. And even once you find a vaccine, you're going to have to mass produce it. Right? And that's going to take time as well. So I feel like the travel industry is really going to be hit pretty hard for the next year, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the interesting thing about all of this is that when you started Remote Work Bay, we were talking about something that was still very novel. You and I have been really fortunate to be able to work remote in our careers. I'm sure you've had a job before like mine where I fought really hard to have the privilege to work from home, even just a couple of a week. And between the time that I last saw you and now, it's become completely mandatory by pretty much anyone who's not an essential worker. And even essential workers are pushing for, a couple days a week you can work from home. They want to. So it's been super fascinating. I'm sure this was actually the perfect time to pivot into sharing your expertise in that space. Kind of like how actually I was homeschooled through high school, and something that used to have people say, oh, really? You were homeschooled? Is now like, oh, I've been doing it for 4 months. And this is how I feel about homeschooling. But it's interesting how these concepts that were so novel up until now are now just a literal fact of life here in 2020.
It's a norm.
Yeah.
I didn't expect this to be a norm. I started Remote Work Bay because I had wealth of knowledge in working remotely for so many years. And I just wanted to share it with my friends that were having difficulties learning how to stay productive at home, especially if you have kids or you have other people in the household and dogs and cats and all the things that could make you procrastinate throughout the whole day, right? And so this is the reason why I'm even doing this. And now I'm actually shifting to a podcast style because I just feel like there's people out there like yourself that have an even larger wealth of knowledge of how can people adjust to this new way of life and new way of working, and how can people not just adjust but thrive.
Right. I agree with you entirely. And something that has been a privilege for people like you and me that don't have families that we have to look after is actually a real struggle right now. I have friends who are fighting to figure out how to both be on Zoom calls at the same time while juggling toddlers and keeping them from falling out the window or whatever it is that toddlers do, and still be productive and recognize that it isn't temporal. But I do think one thing that's come out of it all is that hopefully we all have more grace for each other because we understand how difficult it is and how challenging it is to get our everyday day jobs done and still live and function. So I would say I personally have seen a lot more understanding and compassion overall. And I'm hoping we can continue with that trend.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of go off of that and like your background in the travel industry, considering how hard your industry was hit this year, I mean, how do you think it's going to affect the trends of just digital nomads in general?
Yeah, so TPG is really fortunate in that we have such a big brand and we have a great parent company backing us, that we have a lot of resources to pivot and understand where we want to go next and be really strategic about our growth from this point out. But I would say where people have been hit the hardest is in the startups and the influencer world. I come from a long background in many years of tech startups, so I recognize how difficult it is to be on a very tight, demanding schedule for deliverables to begin with, and then now to be hit with a totally global variable that has no end date and no predictions, and nobody across any industry knows what to do about it. So I would say people who have been hit in that space have been hit really hard, including a lot of the freelancers that we've worked with in the past and contributors who work full time with us. And another major space where I've seen that impacted is in the influencer world, where you would know even better than I do, but a lot of these people depend on the ability to travel and share their expertise in order to create content that's relevant to their followers. And of course, they can't travel anywhere. Advertisers don't have the same money to advertise anymore, so budgets are cut across the board. A lot of people have gone from being top of their industry to completely out of work within literally a week.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, my last role at my last company was to do a lot of in-person marketing activation at all the major festivals. I mean, the reason why I was in Austin was
Yes.
Sitting there doing an activation for the last company I worked for. I was supposed to activate at Coachella and VidCon and all of these major conferences and festivals that they're just completely canceled. I mean, either canceled or, they're postponed to 2021.
Right.
I don't even know if festivals are still going to happen. I mean, South by is always in March. Do we really think we're going to be able to host a major festival like
March? Right. And they start planning 6 months in advance or a month. So how do we know?
And they fired, right? Like 30%.
Yeah, they had to lay off close to 40, maybe more than 40% of their staff, literally within hours of their announcement. So that's probably something that I think will change indelibly moving forward. But travel insurance, any type of insurance plan, for the most part, at the beginning of this year, the only way you would be covered under a circumstance like coronavirus would be if you had purchased a all comprehensive insurance plan that covered anything, including global pandemics, because pandemics are not covered under virtually all insurance. The reason why South by had to lay off all of its staff was because the insurance plan that they purchase every single year did not cover a global pandemic. And the same goes for a lot of travelers, your friends who got stranded and had to buy brand new flights. While really robust travel insurance is always a great thing to have, in this particular circumstance, it wouldn't have benefited them unless they had a particularly robust plan. And most of us who travel very consistently probably think, oh, I can handle whatever.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Actually, could you tell us a little bit more about the health insurance that you use? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I spent many years freelancing. And the best thing about it is your paycheck looks beautiful. The worst thing about it is you have no benefits. You're completely on your own. And like you and me, we're super independent women who take care of everything ourselves, and we're not on family insurance plans or anything like that. So you have to make sure you cover your butt, especially when you go to cool adventure spots. But a couple of years ago, the same friend who got stranded in Bali, actually, she owns a travel company, and she does group tours to really cool spots, like caravanning across Western Australia in camp. Isn't that cool? So she knows all about the benefits of travel insurance, and she was the one who introduced me to the whole idea of using an annual travel insurance plan to make sure that your catastrophic injuries or anything like that, any accidents and disasters are covered. But my CEO, for instance, Brian Kelly from thepointsguy, actually evacuated himself from Indonesia back in 2017 when the volcano erupted using his travel insurance. Now, he used his on his credit card, and I have a separate insurance plan that I pay for, which is a little more robust. But regardless, back in the good old days for freelancers, travel insurance plans are a fantastic way to get by. In fact, I spent all of 2018 living off of the health insurance catastrophic coverage from my travel insurance plan. And the way that you activate that is you just have to be within a certain distance from home. So if you saw me on the road, it was actually for budget saving reasons.
So interesting. So did you have two different health insurance plans, or did you just use the travel?
I just used my travel insurance that year. It was too expensive to Cobra. and I hadn't been under a formalized US insurance plan for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's probably not something I would recommend for a long-term solution, but if you know you're in pretty good health and you've got a couple of other fail-safes available to you, the US health insurance system, I personally think is a joke. I grew up in Taiwan and they have
Oh yeah, you
national
have the
health care
best.
there. It's so great. If you don't have insurance from Taiwan, an out-of-pocket office visit is about $6 starting out. So
Wow.
yeah, it's still cheaper than my current coverage under my very robust health insurance plan.
What is the travel insurance provider that you use, and how much does something like that cost?
Yeah, I use AIG's Travel Guard, and they've been fantastic for me. I believe an annual insurance plan, depending on the perks that you choose, ranges from about maybe $250 a year up to, I'm sure you could go top of line and go to several hundred, but still considering it gets me about $30,000 of emergency coverage, and all I have to produce is, the doctor or hospital's note from wherever I am. That's so little to pay for peace of mind. It's like one nice expensive drink in LA.
To use your travel insurance, you have to be away from home for how long? What is the...
So it's not the time that you are away from home, but it's the distance that you are from your home address. So for instance, it isn't just for international trips. My insurance is obviously tied to my home address here in Texas. So if I were even if I were in West Texas, which is several hundred miles away, that would count for me because it's technically a trip that I'm on. However, I believe you can't be on a trip that's longer than 30 days. So I can't use my travel insurance plan, move to Asia, and then claim that indefinitely.
Got it.
But if I'm only in Asia, I think probably for like 30 days, and the terms will vary per insurance plan. But if I'm away for, 3 weeks on a glorious trip with my friend Audrey to Hong Kong and Taiwan and Vietnam, then anything that happens to me on that trip, if I had gotten sicker actually during the time that I met you, I would have gone to see a doctor and that would have been covered under my travel insurance plan. Even if I had ended up puking in the hospital and on an IV, that would all have been covered.
Wow. Right?
So
that's good to have for sure.
Yeah. 100%.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a great tip to have for those of you that
These are the things you file away so you can tell your mother you're okay. Because I don't know about you, but my mom worries a little bit. I didn't realize that most of my friends' moms worry way more though. So I guess I have my mom to thank that she's the one who taught me how to travel and enjoy it. But she kind of just like, what are you doing now? But for a lot of my friends whose mothers call them every day and worry, this is one of the best ways you can assure your parents and prove it on paper that you'll actually be okay and you'll be taken.
Right. I mean, especially when you come from like an Asian background, first generation Asian Americans, I feel like they're very risk adverse. So
yeah, but I think my parents are more risk averse to me quitting my job than they are to me actually being on the road.
True.
So
That's true.
Yeah.
They care more about your employment, how you're doing, if you're making enough money to feed yourself.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's a huge generational difference too, because one of my favorite stories comes from when my cousin, who's a badass interpreter in Taiwan, she used to translate for the president of Taiwan back in the day. And she was always this straight A plus, best school student. So when she was telling me about how she switches jobs every 18 months because she gets bored and she's looking for a better challenge and someplace that can appreciate her skill set more. She told me how my uncle, who is my dad's older brother, was just flabbergasted by this, and it was the best moment of validation I've ever had because I was like, yes, she's not settling and I don't have to either. Not that I was settling, but my dad was always like, why do you do what you do and why are you the way that you are? And I'm just like, look at my cousin, she's doing it.
Well, the funny thing is now so many people are doing that.
So many people are doing that. And it is the right thing to do. I am so firmly a believer that the best way for you to be valued by other people, whether it's a relationship or a company, is for you to value yourself. So don't ever charge less than your worth. Don't ever put up with someone who treats you with disrespect. And the same goes for businesses, brands, employers, any place where you don't feel safe or valued. It's not a place to stay. This is good general travel information as well. But I think that's what drives a lot of people to do remote work as well. Whether you're working for an employer or self-employed, it's all about being able to be your own boss, set your own hours, and to recognize when you do your best work as well.
Absolutely. Have you been full-time with the Points Guy for a while? I know you were working freelance for a little bit. Could you tell us a little bit about your work history and how that all shifted?
Yeah, so I graduated from the University of Texas with a degree in journalism and ethnic studies and promptly proceeded to not do that because I graduated in 2008 and jobs in journalism, not really paying a lot. I think the median income for an undergrad was 28,000 and for a graduate student of journalism was 35.
Wow.
So I went into tech and I loved it. I love sales and I really enjoy fast-paced environments, and tech startups gave me plenty of that. But I also got to work for some really big brands like Google as well, ZocDoc in New York. And in 2015, when I was in New York, I'd been a follower of the Points Guy for a couple of years, but it was just in one of those days where I'd been in my cubicle until 8 p.m. I came out and saw a blog post from one of my coworkers, who was then the editor-in-chief at the time, and he posted an open shout out for contributors and full-time writers. So I thought, well, what do I have to lose? So I got my roommate and my then partner involved, and they helped me put in about 30 total hours of work over the next 5 days. I didn't feel very qualified for the job that I have right now, but I knew that everything I had learned came from the site, and I know how to make a really, really good sales pitch. So I made them a full-on website that answered all of their questions and then some, and I filled it out in a Google Doc as well, just so they couldn't say that I put too much flash into it. And they literally told me, out of 400 applicants, we're considering you primarily because this is a really good application. So the moral you should take from that is never take yourself away from a conversation. Let someone else tell you no instead of qualified. And then the follow-up to that was I contributed for them for a couple of years, and I began writing 40 hours a week or more for them beginning January 2018. So I've been writing full-time at the Points Guy since January.
That's incredible. That's an incredible story.
Thank you.
You've been basically travel writing for most of your career.
A third, actually, but I have been telling stories for my whole career, I would say.
Yeah, for those of you that don't know Kat, she's an incredible storyteller and writer. And I mean, even on your socials, it's like, I just love like reading all of your posts because they're just so like eloquently put and they're so interesting and creative. So
thank you. I will pay Audrey after this. That is the beauty of traveling. Like what you get to do when you travel is meet people in their ultimate element, whether you're meeting them at home or out. Like all of the usual barriers that we put up for ourselves are kind of stripped away. Mm-hmm. Well, literally, if you're sick in front of someone like this, right? You just get to meet people in a very different way. And I think that's some of the beauty that travel has brought into my life, being able to work remote. I've connected with travelers from Australia on a round the world trip, just sitting next to them in Starbucks by my house.
Wow.
So I think the best thing that travel has ever taught me is just learning to speak with different people. And I think naturally, as you meet more people and you really listen to where they're coming from and what they've been through, every one of us turns into a storyteller as a result.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's the reason why I love traveling as well. That's awesome. So, I mean, with that being said, like, what do you think people will be traveling to? I mean, clearly it's going to be within the state, but you know, where do you see that trending?
I think there will be a lot of domestic destinations that people will begin visiting. A lot of the national parks have offered really great incentives. I believe I saw a headline today that you can get up to 30% off of housing at 4 different national parks. Wow. I read a lot of TPG headlines, even if I don't get to follow the articles. So they're all really exciting. We've been seeing the trend of people visiting the Caribbean. I personally feel like holding up for a couple of months is probably the easiest and safest way to handle everything, because the really responsible countries are doing a lot to flatten the curve, of course. But if you were hoping to lounge on the beach without a face mask on, you're going to have to make sure you put one on whenever you're close to anyone. When you're walking around the resort, you want to be careful when you're by the pool or in the restaurant or anything like that. So the Caribbean has been a popular destination because a lot of those island countries are beginning to reopen. But I do think, depending on how we end up flattening the curve, we might be able to go to a couple of other really great countries as well outside of that little Caribbean bubble. We just hurry up and do the right thing and flatten the curve as best as we can. I don't think it will ever be the same, honestly. If you remember how Asia has been over the last 20 years since SARS, it won't be the same, and we're all going to have to sacrifice a little bit of our comfort just to go and do and be the things that we want. However, I think travel will be very similar to how it was after 9/11. We're going to give up a little bit of our comfort, a little bit of our privacy and security in order to keep society safer as a whole. So we should get used to temperature checks. We should get used to filling out forms asking us where we've been and our overall health. But I personally don't see those as drawbacks. I see them as tools that help keep us safer and keep other people safe around us as well. So I think that will be one of the big changes. I think destinations wise, a lot of domestic spots will come up for sure. A lot of outdoorsy places. But even beyond that, I think we'll all learn to appreciate what is in front of us more. I know you and I don't spend a lot of time in LA and Austin, but I recently did a one-night staycation here in Austin, Texas. And it made me realize that I don't ever see my city as a tourist in the same kind of way I've seen dozens of places around the world. And it gave me a whole new appreciation for where I've chosen to live for the time being. I'm sure you feel the same way. You never know if we might pick up and move somewhere. But, you know, as they say, wherever you are, be all there. And I actually wanted to follow up that story by saying I didn't have to look up any restaurants because I know Austin so well. But it turns out I still did, because it depended on who was still open and still allowing dine-in and where it was safe at the time to go and eat.
Right.
So I ended up getting a local fast food chain and a local food truck that was just out on Rainy Street, and it was great. Nobody was there. It wasn't crowded. The weather was really awesome. And I just sat there eating my fried Brussels sprouts and my chicken wrap with more joy than I've had in a lot of other places. And it really reminded me of all of the times when you're on the road and things don't go your way. My trip to Italy in 2018 actually was one of the most beautiful places and times and experiences of my life. It was also probably one of the most frustrating trips I've ever had. I don't know if I've ever told you or not, but I ended up being delayed by a huge storm before I even left the States. So I missed my very first connecting flight to Italy, which then meant my one checked bag, I usually never check bags, my checked bag was delayed for a full week. And I went to Italy for a photography workshop. So all of my gear, all of the fancy clothes I'd brought for the model, they were all gone. I had to replace it all. And then there were a series of train strikes in Italy. So I kept not being able to get where I needed to go. I got diverted to Florence instead of going to Cinque Terre. I locked myself out of my Airbnb at 2 a.m. in the mountains. My phone was in the house. There was water boiling on the stove. It just, every possible mishap you could think of happened. And in fact, at one point I sat down on my suitcase in a McDonald's, just so frustrated. I had to sulk for 30 minutes before I could move on. I was just literally huffing and steam was coming out of my head. But what's interesting is, as I've been here in lockdown, thinking about, you know, where do I want to go back to next? The place that's consistently come to mind has been Italy, because after all this time, what really stands out in my head is just how beautiful it was, how kind the people were, how breathtaking the food was. I don't necessarily remember how miserable it felt. I remember that these things happened, but I don't remember the nitty-gritty details of why it was so crap. And I'm sure you relate. You've probably felt the same way about travel before. But when I think back to Vietnam, I think it's funny that I was sick, because I'm not sick now and I don't remember what it feels like, but I remember how much fun I had with you and our friends, and how memorable that New Year's was, and how ridiculously hard it was to get there. And I think that's what we'll all take away from 2020. We're going to look back and we're going to laugh at how ridiculous it was, that we all had to be grounded, and we all had to learn how to cook better. And we all came to recognize which of our friends were already really great chefs and would share food with us. And it's going to make us appreciate how much we love going out in our own cities, the people that we feel safe to quarantine around.
Yeah.
So I think more than anything, 2020 will be less about where we go and more about the journey.
Absolutely. And I feel like there are a lot of positives to what's happening in our world today as well, because a lot of my friends, for example, that don't normally get to see their kids grow up are getting the opportunity to, even if it is, you know, it could give them a headache sometimes to be like quarantined at home with their like toddlers, right? But at the end of the day, it's like, think of all the time you get to spend with your family and loved, you know. So there are definitely positive effects of what's going on.
There are. For instance, my mom, actually, we haven't lived together since I was 19, and I went straight from my parents' house, having been homeschooled all my life, to college in a whole separate continent. And this was back in the day of phone cards, so, you know, I didn't call home very often. But my mom actually is living with me and has been living with me for more than 2 months now. So we're getting a chance to be reacquainted. I can smell delicious food that she's making right now. And it's been a really touching time where we've had our frictions, but also I think we've found a newfound respect and appreciation for each other that we don't normally get because we're always on the go. So it's been a really awful, beautiful, there's a writer who calls it brutiful because brutal and beautiful all at once. And I think that's how we'll look back on 2020. It's been a devastating year for a lot of people and miserable at best for the rest of us. And I truly hope this allows us to find the sort of unity that we've been missing for some time. I hope it brings a little bit of that magic of travel here to where we are at home and allows us all to treat ourselves and the people around us with a little more wonder and grace.
Right. Absolutely. Well, do you have any other tips or feedback or anything else you'd like to share with our viewers today?
Ooh, I will say one of my best travel tips is if you've got T-Mobile, they have this amazing plan which comes with international service. It's 2G. It's really slow. I will say that. But I used to have AT&T and I would have to pay, I think, $10 a day or $10 for maybe 300 megabytes. I think Verizon is the one that charges $10 a day for international service, and it's not much faster. So that T-Mobile plan has seen me through a lot of countries and saved me a lot of money. So if you're looking for a good plan to use internationally, T-Mobile has a solid one, but not having to switch SIM cards constantly, such a blessing.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do people find you?
So you can find me primarily on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Katherine Fan. I'm fangirling around the world, and we'll post that as well in the comments here.
Well, thank you so much, Kat. I hope to see you soon. Please stay safe, and thanks for being a part of the first podcast.
Yeah, we'll see each other in a first class lounge soon.
Awesome.